Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Greetings, thank you for joining us. Please use the chat feature to tell us where you're joining from. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for one contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The nurse planner, content expert, faculty, and other in control of the content today have no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and log in to our learning management system to complete an evaluation form. Information on how to access this will be emailed to all attendees 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Following the presentation, if we have time, we will have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenter. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing their expertise with us today. Of note, thoughts and views expressed are that of the presenter and not necessarily reflect that of Sigma. Our speaker today is Keith Hovey. Keith's mission is to inspire, teach, and support every person to become the best possible version of themselves through better health so that they can find purpose and better serve their communities. Keith does this by working as a nurse attorney for the regional healthcare provider. On a daily basis, Keith advises clinical and administrative leaders on state and federal laws concerning a variety of healthcare related topics, such as negotiating and drafting healthcare related agreements. Keith attended Case Western Reserve University's Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing, where he graduated with honors and received the Cushing Robb Prize for Outstanding Achievement. He then attended Seton Hall Law School as a faculty scholar, graduating with honors. Keith has published and frequently presents on numerous topics pertaining to healthcare and the law. We're so grateful to have you, and we'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate it. I want to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of information to cover today. As you can see, right, the title is A Lawyer's Innovation in Healthcare Using the Nursing Process. What we're really going to do today is we're going to go through a case study that involves a novel healthcare program that we have started at the institution that I currently work at in response to what seemed like a legal problem, but turned out in part to also be a healthcare problem. And I think what I found incredibly valuable throughout my career is that despite sort of the legal process not being always being more analytical, that I found that I rely often on my nursing education, and particularly the nursing process and how I approach problems, and am able to come up with solutions that help address the concerns that are being identified and being raised. And then I'm able to sort of continue to move, shall we say, the ball forward, and that help the institution make progress in being a better institution and help providing better care to its patients and serving the community. So with that, let's sort of look at the learning outcomes, right? It's identify the 5 steps of the nursing process. For most of you, right, this is going to be a bit redundant, but I think going through each individual steps in the case study will be helpful as to how I use that process in this particular example to come up with a novel healthcare program. Second, recognize the benefits of employing the nursing process outside of the clinical setting, meaning that the benefits of the nursing process is that it doesn't have to be limited to direct patient care. It actually, I find it incredibly valuable when dealing with problems, whether they are legal in nature, whether they are administrative or logistical, that the nursing process really is a very practical problem-solving tool that you can use in a variety of settings. And 3, understand that empathy can be employed as a clinical tool to assist patients. And this actually pertains to the actual program itself. The program that I will be referring to, we have called the PEACE program, PEACE. That stands for the Patient Employee Assistance and Coordination and Evaluation program. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the slides. But the short moniker for it is it's the PEACE program. So let's talk about what is the issue. So the issue as legal counsel that I was presented to by administration was, how do we evaluate whether to allow an employed provider, meaning a physician or advanced practice provider like a nurse practitioner, to terminate a patient from an outpatient practice. So to give you a little bit of background, we are a regional healthcare provider in central New Jersey. That's the Trenton, Princeton area. And as we were growing as a healthcare system, we were acquiring a number of outpatient practices, and we would continue to operate those practices. So over the span of about a 4 to 5 year period, we had grown exponentially in the outpatient practice setting, and we had acquired a lot of practices, and all of them had different methods by which they went about terminating patients. So what we needed to address was how is it that we were going to make determinations? So the first question was sort of the who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? So who is going to be responsible for making the decision for termination? What alternatives to termination existed, if any? When would we be terminating? How would we be terminating? Which were legal questions that had to be asked and answered. Where were they being terminated from? Meaning, was the patient going to be just simply terminated from the practice, or were they going to be terminated from the healthcare system as a whole? And why? Why were they being terminated? What was the basis? Was it a legal basis, or was it a clinical rationale? So with that, then the goal, right, that we identified as a result of the issue was we wanted to create a workable, uniform process to address requests for termination of the patient relationship by employed providers, as we said, for an ever-expanding regional healthcare system, right? So with that being the goal, then, right, I was tasked with, my thought process was, well, look, the easy thing I could do is essentially just do some legal research, come up with some legal answers, and then sort of push the issue back onto administration. But I thought that given my clinical background and my legal expertise, that we could actually do more here, right? That we could do more than just simply say what the legal minimum requirements were, or that threshold that had to be met in order to terminate a patient. So with that, right, I turned to the nursing process, which I had used before in sort of my sort of everyday work life, and addressing a whole host of problems. But I thought this was actually a great opportunity to do something greater in addressing sort of what seemed to be not what I would initially thought was just an organizational issue, but I really found out in doing some research actually is, I would say, a national, if not global issue as to how we address patient terminations and actually barriers to healthcare. So we all know, right? So here it is, just sort of by point of reference, right? Is the nursing process, it's assessment, it's diagnosis, it's planning, implementation, and then evaluation. And I put in here reassessment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, right? Because I don't think, particularly when you're dealing with patients or you're dealing with systems, that evaluation is the end of the process. That really evaluation also involves this component of reassessment, which is implicit in the diagram. As you see, the arrow from evaluation goes back to assessment, right? It's a continuation, depending on if you're dealing with a issue that is dynamic, as often, patients and systems are. So I started with the first one, which is the assessment phase, right? And with that, what we had to say is, what we had to discover is, where are we, right? Is the stated problem an actual problem? Is it legal in nature? Is it clinical in nature? Is it operational? And I think at the outset, we didn't have the answer to that question. So my thinking was, well, let's find out what the present state of the organization is as to this problem, the present state as to what the law says on this issue, and what does the field, what does Advanced practice providers, what does nursing say on the issue? What does medicine say on the issue of terminating patients? So as to the institution, I wanted to, right, the most logical thing is just what's the policy? What does the organization have as a policy? And then my next is, well, if I'm going to look at the law, what does the law tell me, right? What I had to research and review statutes and regulations on what the requirements were, if any, at the state level as to when you can and can't terminate a patient and how you have to go about doing it, timing requirements, notification requirements. And then also, what were the limitations? When can't we terminate? When does the law say we're not allowed to? Because those are important if I'm going to counsel an organization and tell them, hey, we're not allowed to terminate a patient because of A, B, and C. So therefore, that would have to go into ultimately some form of a policy so that people are on notice within the institution that a basis for termination is not legal and therefore can't be a reason we decide to stop treating a patient. And then lastly, right, what does the field say, right? What does the AMA and the ANA, what does evidence-based practice, what are there any studies that have been done on alternatives to termination? Are there any commentaries in the literature? Are there any opinions, op-eds? So there was a lot of information that had to be reviewed to help sort of assess and identify where we are as to the current state, just as you would a patient, right? A patient presents, what's their current condition, what's their status, based on the information that we can, glean. So then here are the answers that I was able to come up with to those questions, right? First, we had no existing policy. Not surprising, lots of institutions, well, I can't say it, that many institutions, as they are growing, right, they end up developing policies in response to some issues that they see and identify. So this is one of those instances, right? We identify a need, so we knew ultimately that we were going to need some sort of a written policy at some point. What did the law say? Well, all the law said was that we needed 30 days written notice to a patient, and that would satisfy the requirements under the law. Note, right, when I'm talking about the law, I'm talking about the minimum standards. I'm not talking about a North Star or aspirational goal. I'm talking about this is the minimum that the law requires. The next question that I had researched, right, was what limitations? Well, as you would expect, right, we cannot terminate a patient for discriminatory reasons based on, race, gender, ethnicity, pre-existing condition. So that was important, so that in that way, we knew that if there was a request for a termination, that the termination had to be clinical in nature. It couldn't be some form of discrimination. Another legal requirement, right, is there a lack of an alternate provider? Meaning, if we're discharging a patient, we need to make sure that that patient, if they are under the need of continuing care, that they have another provider that is available in the area. Also, a consideration that had to be addressed is whether or not there was existing threatened litigation. And if that was the basis for termination, that could be problematic under the law. And then the last one, right, is active care late-term pregnancy, meaning that would termination of the provider-patient relationship jeopardize the patient's health because the 30 days written notice would somehow jeopardize the ability of the patient to find a provider to continue whatever their active care needs were in the short term. And then lastly, right, was what did the literature tell us? And what I found was that there really is not by way of research on the actual use of mediators, although that was what is proposed in much of the literature, both by lawyers and providers, practitioners. what I noticed is that the reference was that the practice should hire a mediator to confer with the patient about the problems that the provider perceived were threatening the provider-patient relationship. Having a litigation background, I found the use of a mediator a little bit problematic because the mediator's focus, even assuming one was used, is really, it's hired by the practice, seems like an extension, would seem like an extension of the practice to the patient. And in litigation, if anyone's ever been involved in litigation, they know that a mediator's goal really is to avoid litigation. It's not to foster trust. It's not to identify barriers to care. It's not patient focused. And because of that, my inclination was a little reluctant, with some reluctance on using mediators for the purposes of creating a viable alternative. Moreover, I didn't see much, if anything, by way of any studies showing the effectiveness of mediators, despite the fact that for years they have been promoted as the alternative to termination. I hadn't seen anything that indicated that they were actually effective or that they'd actually ever been utilized by outpatient practices. So with those, with those answers, we then sort of knew what the current status of the issue was, and it's what did we know and what did we now know that we didn't know before, and what had we learned. So we now know, as a result of my assessment, is that we had a lack of uniformity amongst our practices, because there was no written policy. Each practice was sort of defaulting to whatever they had done previously or whatever they believed was sort of in the best interests of the practice where they were providing care. We also, because we didn't have a policy, so because each practice was doing their own thing, what happens is then there was no way for us to monitor how many terminations were actually happening. As a result, because we didn't have a formal process in place, that resulted in administrative delays, because sometimes providers and practices would reach out to legal, sometimes they would reach out to administration, sometimes they were acting unilaterally. And because of that confusion, as you would imagine, there were delays in addressing concerns, particularly in those cases where the provider may not want to terminate, but it seemed that maybe it was appropriate. For example, missed appointments, repeatedly being late for appointments, not adhering to a care plan, but the fact that there may have been some extenuating circumstances for non-compliance with care. So in a lot of these instances, there was significant delays as we were conducting evaluations, as the process by how the requests came in and who actually should be making the determination wasn't consistent. It created confusions, and the confusion resulted in delays in determinations. We also noted is that because the practices are making the decisions, no one's communicating, or at least no one with the special skill set as to therapeutic communication is contacting the patients in these instances. We realized we had a very provider-centered approach. We were only getting half the story when we were getting these requests for termination. And then as a result, as you would expect, there was a lot of confusion and feelings of dejection by the patients, because now they're being terminated from a practice. Does that mean they're terminated from the system? Does that mean that they can't go to the emergency department? So because of that, or were they being just terminated from the individual provider and they could see another provider in the practice? So because of that, there was a lot of confusion, and in response to confusion, the concern that I had is that the patient then at that point in time may say, or may opt to leave the system entirely because they're not sure. And rather than reach out to the very practice that just sent them a letter terminating them, they may just opt to not get care and try to seek care elsewhere. And as a result, right, this creates organizational frustration, right? Everyone from the secretaries, the schedulers, the nurses in the outpatient practices, the providers themselves, and administration, there was no alignment, right? There was no consistency, or there was no sort of overarching mission that everyone was adhering to. Everyone was sort of doing their own thing, right? Sort of imagine being on a basketball team and no one knowing which hoop to shoot at, and not knowing necessarily who in fact is actually on your team. And that's sort of where we were at from an assessment standpoint. So then, right, so then now that we have all of our pertinent information, we now then move into, now that we've completed what I would call our initial assessment, we now move into, right, the diagnosis. So based on the information we had, what was the cause of the challenge? What was creating the issue for the organization? And what I concluded, right, is that we had a lack of a uniform process. So that's the first component, the lack of uniformity in a process that failed to include the patient's perspective, right? So we talked about it was a provider-focused solution at that point in time, or that's the way it was. The program was running on default, was that was provider oriented. Well, I felt that we weren't including the patient's perspective of interactions with the providers, or we weren't identifying any potential barriers to care, right? So that's another component we haven't been addressing. And were the patient's either perspectives or the potential barriers, were they contributing to the patient's behavior that was then serving as the basis for the termination, right? So to state it sort of a little bit differently, in the absence of uniformity and patient perspective, we had a lack of empathy. We weren't showing any empathy, and empathy not only to the patients, although that was the major concern, is that by failing to have uniformity and reliability within the organization as to how to process these potential issues as to whether or not we were going to terminate a patient, it created a lot of frustration within our administrative and our clinical team members. So we weren't even showing them empathy by the fact that we didn't have a reliable system, process that they could follow in order to address their concerns about patients who may warrant termination. So the next step, so now we've identified that the lack of uniformity and lack of empathy is our diagnosis. We then had to create a plan, right? And the way I look at plan is sort of twofold. There's two components of planning, right? There is your short-term and your long-term. So Stephen Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has a chapter dedicated to begin with the end in mind. And with that, right, what he's saying is that when you start to undertake solving a problem, you have to have some concept in your mind as to what you want the end result to look like. And I think that it's important to note that there's an immediacy component to problems, meaning how do I sort of address the immediate needs of the individual, the immediate needs of the team, the immediate needs of, say, the organization. And then I think for some problems, right, or actually all problems, is that how do they tie into the long-term mission, the overarching principle or values of you as a person, your team, or your organization. And Simon Sinek calls this the just cause. And it's important to note that a just cause is not, for it to be appropriately drafted, is not achievable. It's a laudable goal that will never be achieved in an individual's lifetime. So I wanted to create that mission as part of the planning, because I wanted to make sure that we were not just addressing the immediate concerns and treating the problem administratively, but that we were really getting to the root cause of some of the frustration, was the absence of empathy and an appreciation as to what both the people within the organization, our employed providers and administrative personnel, as well as what our patients were experiencing. So for the short-term goal, it's simple. We create a uniform process. That's a policy. I'm a lawyer. We do that all the time. And that would create some consistency. That doesn't mean we're doing the right thing, right? And I'll put sort of the right thing, meaning, is that really consistent with what our values are? And that's where the just cause comes in. So to that end, we came up with a statement that says, I came up with this mission that says our goal is to create an organization that meets every patient where they are at, physically, mentally, emotionally, and socioeconomically, so that everyone receives the care that they need to live their healthiest lives and realize their full human potential. That is a laudable goal. That is also unachievable in my lifetime, right? That any organization that I work at, that we are going to meet every single patient where they're at every level where they exist, so they live the healthiest lives possible and they realize their full human potential, right? Our patients are going to fail at times. We as an organization are going to fail them at times, and the providers who provide care for them are going to fail them at times. But this is the goal. This is where we ultimately want to be. So I'll give you an example, right? If you have a patient I'll give you an example for short and long-term goals. If you have a patient that comes into the emergency department and they are suffering a heart attack, right? They're having a myocardial infarction, right? So what do? Right? We treat their immediate needs, right? We do the EKG, we do a blood draw, we send them to the cath lab if appropriate. They may end up with emergency bypass surgery. We treat the immediate need. And that's what we did here. We created a policy, right? And we'll talk more about sort of the nuts and bolts of the policy in a bit, but part of it, right, is we were going to have to create a policy to tell everybody how we were going to handle terminations going forward. The values component, right? So the long term is, once we've stabilized the patient, right? Once we've completed our assessment and our diagnosis, the long-term planning, in addition to the short term, is what's the ultimate goal for that person who's had a heart attack? Well, maybe we want them to lose weight. We need them to exercise more. We need them to diet be better. Maybe their blood pressure needs to be better monitored and brought under control. So the goal for that patient is that they never have another heart attack ever again. That may be unachievable, right? Or because the difficulty with diet compliance, exercise compliance. But the reality is that's the ultimate goal, even if we never get there. And we want to do that, right? We want that long-term goal. We want them to adhere to those things because we want them to be healthy, right? We want them to be as well as they can, given the fact that they've now had a heart attack. So when we're planning, right, so what the nuts and bolts, how are we going to achieve our short-term and our long-term? We then have to ask ourselves, well, what resources do we have available to us? And at that point, then we have to think, okay, well, there's really three components when you're dealing with an organization, is you have time, people, and money. So let's assume, for the purposes of this problem, right, the issue that we really have here is how are we spending our time in response to a request for termination, and what people are involved as part of the process. So from the people standpoint, we said, well, look, the idea that I came up with was that why don't we use social workers, right? Secretaries don't necessarily, and schedulers, and even nurses, although we've had training in therapeutic communications, we really don't have the best skill set to understand sort of what resources exist within the community to help individuals with respect to barriers to healthcare. And social workers are also trained that in such a way that with therapeutic communication, so now they've got sort of this dual skill set of both access and knowledge of community resources. They have knowledge of therapeutic communication. And there's actually another component, right, which is they understand the inner workings of your organization, right? The interplay between the institution or the hospitals and the workings of the outpatient practices. Other people that we needed to be involved were administrative directors for the outpatient practices. In our institution, those are the people that interact on a regular basis with the lead physicians for those practices, as well as the practice administrators who are located in those practices. So those are sort of the people that are at the next level just above, and they see how all of the practices are functioning. We have a couple administrative directors for specialties, and we have one for primary care. So they sort of have a higher level view as to how the practices are operating. Legal resources, right? That would be someone like myself that understands the law to be able to provide at least some legal guidance in response to requests for termination or assistance. And then mental health experts. When we have more complicated patients, we were able to utilize the resources such as our outpatient psychiatrists and behavioral health experts. And then IT, right? We're talking about a new process. So don't overlook the ability, availability, and even sometimes the eagerness of IT support to create internal websites and pathways for communications outside of sort of your normal email network. And what we did is we actually ended up creating an internal dashboard just for these types of requests. So then that way we can monitor and keep track of them as well as process them. And we can actually triage them based on the nature of the request, meaning is a termination request because of missed appointments, or is it possible that the termination may be as a result of a verbal altercation and may require more immediacy? So we're able to sort of triage, who the social worker contacts sooner based on the nature of the request. And then the next is then time, right? So time being sort of one is the just cause, right? You have to create the just cause, but you also have to be willing to reinforce it. So we created bi-weekly meetings. So then that way we were always processing and constantly reevaluating all the requests that were coming in for possible termination consideration. But at the beginning of every meeting, particularly when we had our initial startup, we always repeated the just cause mission at the beginning of every meeting, so that everyone understood that no matter what the problems were that arose, that they were going to be measured against the just cause. So
Keith, can I chime in here for a minute? We have a couple questions related to the just cause.
Sure.
And so I think this might be a good place to ask them.
Sure.
Number one, could you reiterate the name of the author of the concept of just cause? And is the just cause based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
So the first question, so the answer to the first question is his name is Simon Sinek, Sinek. He's done a TED talk that doesn't pertain to this issue, but he's also done a number of lectures. And one of I believe it's Start With Why. And so very good public speaker, talks a lot about sort of mission-based, or purpose-based organizations. The next, right, is we talked about Maslow's hierarchy. So actually, interestingly, Simon Sinek speaks to this issue, right? It's not based on Maslow's hierarchy, because Maslow's hierarchy is based on what one would consider sort of immediate primal needs, right? So I think the difference here with the just cause is just cause speaks to community, right? So greater purpose more so than yourself, rather than Maslow's hierarchy, which, maybe, food or, right? So you're talking about hunger, right? I think what we're talking about with just cause is really about sort of emotional fulfillment and connection through a value-based system. So that's where we deviate, that's where just cause deviates from Maslow.
Yeah, I like that explanation. Thank you for that. And what about SMART goals? Can setting SMART goals impact the just cause positively so that it can be achievable?
Right. So I think what we're talking about with SMART goals, right, is essentially it's a tool, particularly, and we used it here sort of loosely for the purposes of having some objective criteria to implement a health program. I can't speak to whether or not SMART goals would be equally effective, although they do have general applicability to problem solving as a whole. What I find is that in healthcare, when you do have a just cause, utilizing SMART goals, right, is very effective, because it actually serves as a reminder as to, am I doing right? Okay, is it specific, right? Is it measurable? Is it achievable, right? When you start to go through that process, right, it's a reminder, like, am I actually doing the things I need to fulfill the just cause, knowing that the purpose of the just cause is what you're going to be measuring, like ultimately measuring against from a value-based system.
Perfect. Yeah. And in regards to planning and identifying the resources of people, how does the global healthcare workforce shortage affect the resources, aka the people, in the planning phase?
So I think that's going to be on a case by case basis. I think when you're looking at people, what you're really looking at when you're trying to solve problems is skill set. So, for example, right, the benefit that I brought to the program that I created was not just the legal skill set, but it was also my clinical as a nurse, right? It created sort of a slightly different perspective. You can't necessarily then just sort of replace me with another lawyer, right? Because the question is that lawyer coming with a clinical lens? Are they coming at it with an empathy-based lens, right? Are they adhering to the just cause? So I think sometimes, we feel like we need, like, oh, we have a nurse, we need a nurse. And it's not necessarily, people are not fungible in that regard, right? I mean, sometimes based on your policies or programs, legal requirements, you may need to have a certain type of physician, a certain, person of a certain license, and that's true. More important than that, though, I think when you're looking to assemble a team, that you need to look at skill set and you need buy-in, right? I don't want anyone on my team who doesn't adhere to the values. If they don't believe in the just cause, that is the purpose of the group, then they're not going to be helpful. They're not going to be productive, right? They're not going to be a contributing member. I want someone who's, shall we say, so willing to do it for free, right? This is not, if you notice, right, I'm an attorney. What I'm talking about is not a legal solution, right? If I wanted a legal solution, I could have just told them, provide them 30 days notice, have administration approve the termination, and we would have been done with it, right? But I believe that we could do this better, So I needed people who would sort of have the skill set, but also had the belief in the mission on my team. And I think that is really where a lot of teams and working groups fail, is that they don't believe, the people don't know what the mission is. And even when the mission's stated, that they're not buying in. I don't understand when people apply for jobs, why at the top of their resume isn't their own personal mission statement. I don't understand when organizations, right, talk about or seeking people who want to hire them, why the mission statement isn't the first thing. I want everyone buying into the organization. I want everyone buying into the team. I want everyone buying into me. So I think that at the end of the day, when we talk about resources from a people standpoint comes from the individual skill sets that the people that you know possess, and along with adherence to the just cause. I hope that
Perfect.
answers the question, although a bit long-winded.
That's all right. That's all right. We'll pause there with the questions and let you keep moving.
All right. So next, right, as we go on to implementation, we've identified the just cause, we've established our team, we scheduled our regular meetings. So now and then we have a policy now to create a formal process for receiving and managing requests. And that formal process was that individual providers and the practices could no longer unilaterally terminate, that before termination had to occur, the patient had to be referred to the peace committee. And what that meant is then once a patient was referred for consideration for termination, the social worker would contact the patient and ask the patient for their perspective. They would say, hey, you've missed a couple appointments. What's going on? You seem to be having trouble making it to your appointments on time. What's going on? You had a verbal altercation with the secretary or with the nurse. Tell me what was happening. And what we found, is as a result of that process, patients felt emboldened, they felt valued, and then they were disclosing information about our organization that we weren't getting anywhere else, At that point, we were all of a sudden realizing that maybe there were times as the provider or as the organization, we had system failures or we had individual failures that required more education and training as to how to interact with patients, or just how to appreciate the fact that there's a power imbalance between providers, healthcare systems, and the patients, and that the patients are doing one of three things, in response to conflict. People either move away, they move towards, or they move against, And people that move away stop showing up for appointments, they miss appointments, you don't hear from them. So I guess it doesn't really matter, that doesn't create a conflict. They move towards you, which means, they try to be people pleasing, they make the next appointment, they make the next 2 or 3, but then they fall off again. And then you have patients who move against. And those are patients that we otherwise call as challenging, demanding, obstinate. And what we're maybe not appreciating, and now we started to realize, is no, maybe this patient is just having a communication issue with the provider, and that the patient actually has reasons. And given the fact that we've got so much from a time crunch standpoint with how quickly and how, moving patients over and work unit, RVUs, and productivity goals and thresholds, that providers don't necessarily always have the time. And with that, we have to appreciate that this is the only appointment that patient has, we as providers, as an institution, we're doing hundreds of thousands of visits a year. But for that patient, this is one of 3 appointments they may have the entire year. So for them, that's a really important GI appointment. And if that appointment gets canceled because all of a sudden the doctor decides to go on vacation, well, then maybe the patient's going to get really frustrated. Or maybe the fact that the patient shows up for 15 minutes late and then is told they can't be seen and they have to reschedule, and the next appointment isn't for 4 months. But the last time they showed up 15 minutes early, they waited an hour before the doctor saw them. That may be creating some frustration as well. And I think by having the social worker contact the patient, we were finally understanding or having a better appreciation as to what the patient's experience was and how we could do better. So as part of the implementation, the other thing I want to focus on, and I know we're running sort of tight on time, so let me just go back a second, is when you implement a new system, you have to allow for mistakes, right? And the way that you address mistakes is with education and understanding, right? Again, remember I talked about empathy for the people that work within the organization? That's just as important. That's why PEACE starts off with the patient employee assistance coordination and evaluation. So what we need to understand, I just got a notice that lost audio. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So what I want to re-emphasize, right, is that what we're talking about when we institute new programs, and even when we have new hires into our team or into our organization, is that we're talking about behavior modification. And behavior modification takes time. And part of that time requires understanding and also requires you to have the ability to make mistakes, to then learn, to then do better. I think this is where a lot of teams and organizations fail, is they think that simply because they put out a new policy or a new initiative, that once they do that, they're done. And that's where I think then the next step becomes really, really important, which is the evaluation, which is, are we actually not only achieving the objectives we initially set out for ourselves, but how are we doing from the standpoint of like, are we having continued adherence moving forward? And that's again where your just cause becomes really important, because as new cases come up, as new people come into your team, you're always measuring the problem or the concern against the just cause, right? And you're educating against, sort of not again, you're under the rubric, right? Under the guise of what is the just cause. Your decision making has to be in compliance or sort of in conformance with the values stated in the just cause. So the evaluation reassessment, right? So what did we have from a short-term standpoint? Well, we had uniformity of process, right? We now had all requests coming to us, or at least the majority of them. We had a increased number in referrals to the program. So we knew that people were aware of the new initiative because we were actually getting requests. We were developing care plans. So with respect to developing these care plans, right, from the social worker and the administrative directors in lieu of termination. We were coming up with alternatives to termination for patients. And then we were then sort of monitoring, were patients adhering to these care plans, meaning were they having follow-up visits? Many of them were, at least in the short term. The program has only been in place for about 18 months. So we don't have any long-term data, but at least in the immediate, we've noticed a lot of patients were able to follow up with their subsequent appointments. Subjective results have all been positive, right? The administrative approval. Right, because we're seeing more patients, the patients are staying in the system, they're getting more visits, more procedures. That's a win-win for everyone. Patients have been positive overall. Some have obviously, because of frustration with the system, may have self-selected to go see another provider. A lot of patients feel appreciated and seen as a result of the social worker feedback. So that's been anecdotal. Provider feedback, also anecdotal, but they seem to appreciate the process and are finding that they're developing at times better relationships and understanding how to better manage some of the more challenging patients who otherwise would have been terminated in the past. And office administrator feedback has been positive in that there's now reliability. They know that there's a process in place, and there's expectation that we're going to continue to adhere to it. But their feedback is based on the fact that there's now consistency and reliability. So with that, The last is, right, evaluation and reassessment, right? Evaluation is the effectiveness as to the initial plan. Reassessment, or assessment as we sort of start the process over, is the just cause. How close are we? Are we closer to getting to our ultimate goal? So the first one, right, is turnaround time. We reduced patient frustration, employee awareness. So we had increased compliance, safety concerns. So safety concerns, right? As we were allowing more patients to stay within the system, there was concerns as to, well, then how do I deal with some of these more challenging patients? So we did more training with de-escalation and safety. We also, more often than not, right, we weren't just simply allowing providers to say, oh, I feel unsafe with this patient. We were forcing them to be more objective with the criteria. If there was there a direct threat? What was the nature of the threat? And working through those, and then providing resources such as not only the training, the availability of a chaperone, the availability of a social worker at the next appointment, so that we weren't just simply defaulting to a provider claiming that they felt unsafe as a basis for termination, but that we were really doing more. Property assessments to make sure at least that our facilities were secure, so that there was a safety threat, that there were at least a visceral feeling of safety, and that there were doors that could be locked, there was exit strategies, right? There was a notification system, alarms, security. So we worked more with risk to help alleviate any concerns that providers may have about a particular patient. And then obviously, the referral tracking system to manage expectations, to let people know, hey, this is how many requests have been submitted. Can you, and then allowing providers or administrative staff who are submitting a request to track the request, to know, had a social worker reached out, had there been a response, was a care plan in place. I think, again, right, at the end of the day, what we've learned in the last 18 months is that empathy towards our patients, and still empathy towards our providers and our administrative team members, has gone a long way, and that we've only terminated a handful of patients, despite the fact that we routinely get anywhere between, I would say, 3 and 6 requests for consideration each week. Given the fact that we're over $1 billion healthcare provider, regional provider in central New Jersey, central southern and eastern Pennsylvania. Central southern New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. Given the number of requests for consideration, the fact that we have terminated very few patients, I think, speaks to the success of the program. The only area I saw a question as to zero tolerance is when there has been an actual perpetration of violence against a provider or any employee of Capitol Health. In that instance, we have terminated, because that person poses is a high future risk of violence in the future. But other than that, we consider and we investigate every single request on the clinical side and do an outreach for the patient. So I hope that other institutions consider implementing a similar program. And I think it really is to the betterment of our patients, and actually to the employment satisfaction of the people who work. And we have such high rates of burnout among healthcare providers. The research seems to indicate that if you show and demonstrate empathy, your job satisfaction actually increases. So this program is good for everyone involved. At least that's been our anecdotal experience, is that everyone on the team will tell you that they enjoy working on the team, they think it's a good program, and they are happy with the way it is operating.
This has been so wonderful, and we're getting such good feedback in the comments. And yes, the references are there. And as we mentioned earlier, this is being recorded and will be available on the Sigma repository if you want to refer back to the slides that Keith provided. A couple questions in regards to the social worker's role in the especially in the peace aspect of it.
Yes.
Um, have you experienced any, I would say, difficulty or any barriers with the social workers being employed with the organization? And would it make sense to use a outside organization to help obtain data and information from the patients that are seeing that fit this quote unquote difficult patient aspect?
So the I can speak as to sort of what our limitations were originally, right? So I said that we had time and we had people. We didn't have money. So going outside the organization for a novel program to then employ social workers at that time, right, wasn't a viable option. From the patient's perspective, and especially in the absence of any literature regarding mediators, my concern is that a mediator, what skill set would they have? Would they be more legal in nature? Would they be more clinical? It just seemed potentially too confusing, I think, to the patient. When the social worker reaches out, the social worker is still reaching out in the capacity in that they're trying to facilitate care for the patient. So they are contacting the patient for an understanding as to what potential barriers exist. Whether that is done by someone who's employed within the institution versus outside the institution, again, I think it goes back to skill set and the availability of resources within your organization. I don't think from the patient's perspective, and again, this is without any data, but at least, anecdotally, the patients have been pretty willing to open up to the social workers. And I think that to the extent that there's any reluctance to speak to the social worker, I don't necessarily know that, or at least there's never been anything that's been relayed back from the social workers to us that the reason the patient isn't speaking to them is because they're an employee of the institution versus had they been employed by a third party. On the data collection side, that really goes to, I think, more as to what the goal is from a research standpoint. I think our initial position is that although we are now cognizant and trying to create an infrastructure where we are collecting more data so we can go back and analyze it, the initial, at the outset of the program, the goal was just simply, we needed a solution and we needed one quickly. And we were able to get that with the biweekly meetings and the use of the social worker. So we weren't focused as much on collecting data initially, simply because, it wasn't the primary objective, wasn't the data. The primary objective was making sure that we were reducing terminations and getting a uniform process in place. I think going forward, that is a goal of ours, but that goes back into the evaluation, reevaluation process. So when we come back around, so now that we've done this evaluation, 18 months out, we now realize, hey, if we need money, if we need more resources by way of more social workers, then the only way we're going to be able to advocate for that is with data. So now what we've done is utilizing IT is then to say, hey, let's make sure we're tracking this information so we can provide relevant data to the decision makers so we can get the additional resources we need, whether it's money or to hire people, or whether it's reallocating resources within the organization.
Yeah, and I love that. And I love that you're, thinking of next steps. And speaking of next steps with this program, since it's been around for, you said, about 18 months, what about inpatient? Is your team thinking about transitioning this to the hospital setting or just keeping it in the outpatient realm right now?
So right now the focus remains on outpatient because that's where the issue for us are, where we see from a patient population exists. On an inpatient side, we're not terminating patients. Patients may leave of their own accord, they may sign out AMA, but for the purpose of treatment, we have vehicles in place, we have options, right? There's physical restraints, there's chemical restraints. We do bring in in-house, we have in-house psychiatrists to the extent that that is part of the issue. So in that regard, we weren't seeing within our patient population that being an immediate concern. I think what we're now starting to see is that because the people who are involved in the decision-making process for the outpatient practices also oversee and are responsible from a leadership standpoint, the inpatient, I think the culture of that just cause is now permeating on the inpatient side as well, right? And that speaks to the validity of the just cause, is that it's not simply limited to outpatients. That's what we're using it for. But that value system, that mission is organizationally based, and it applies to our admitted patients as well as our outpatients, and particularly, and our ED patients as well.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to get to all of the questions today. So Keith, is there a way that people could interact with you outside of this webinar, or is there somehow you would like to connect with our participants if they have additional questions?
Yeah, so so I am switching positions. I am going to be at this email address for the next, was it 2.5 weeks? And then I'll share that. And can we share that in the chat, my email address?
Yes, of course.
So I will type that in, and then you can reach me there. And then at that point in time, if you're unable to get a hold of me, Linda, is it possible for them to reach out to you? And then I'll provide my new contact information once I know it.
Yes, of course.
Switching organizations. Thank you.
Yep. Yep. You can definitely share your email in the chat. You see that Keith put his email right there for you. And of course, if you have any additional questions, you can always email linda@sigmanursing.org, and I can help facilitate the conversation. Keith, I want to thank you so much for all of this great information. The feedback in the comments has been excellent. Everyone is singing your praise about the presentation and how you provided excellent examples. We want to thank everyone for coming to this webinar today. As a reminder, this is being recorded, and 1 week from today, you will be emailed a link with instructions on how to obtain your nursing continuing professional development certificate. And of course, we encourage you to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars and other resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.